Let's look at some examples of gamification for social good. They're in four categories: health and wellness, energy and environment, education, and government. These are by no means all of the potential applications, and I'm only going to give you an example or two in each category as a way to get you thinking about the potential in these areas and the different kinds of approaches that might be involved. The first example is something called Zamzy that comes from an organization called Hope Labs, and Hope Labs is a nonprofit that uses games and game-like systems for better health outcomes. So they do some wonderful work around using serious games for cancer patient recovery. But what I'm going to focus on now is something that they make called the Zamzy. And the Zamzy is a little device that is an accelerometer that keeps track of how active you are, how many steps you take, when you walk up steps, and so forth. And so it measures your physical fitness activity. So therefore it's similar to the Nike Plus system that I mentioned earlier, and also to the Fitbit system that some of you may be familiar with. But Zamzy is interesting because it's targeted at low-income teenagers. There's a terrible problem in the United States about obesity and sedentary lifestyles among low-income communities and especially young people. So Zamzy is an attempt to focus in on that problem using this device. And it works the way you might expect. You get your activity level tracked, and based on that you earn points, and you can unlock badges for various kinds of achievements. You can level up, and you can win various kinds of rewards or earn various kinds of rewards based on your points and so forth. Standard kind of set of game mechanics that we've seen throughout the class. But what Hope Labs has been able to show is that this device, which is designed in a way that's focused in, again, on these particular communities, actually produces real results. So they did a randomized study of 350 teenagers in this community and found a 30% increase in activity levels with the Zamzy. So that's an example of something which, again, the same basic device, the same basic mechanics get used in commercial applications, but it can be targeted and focused in on achieving a social benefit. We've seen several other health and wellness applications already in the course. The Kia system for wellness activities by people in enterprises, Fitocracy to get people to work out and go to the gym more. Here's another one, though, that's a little bit different. This is something called SuperBetter, which is a product of Jane McGonigal's company, which is also called SuperBetter. And SuperBetter is about improving people's life, allowing people to overcome illnesses and to motivate themselves around these kinds of health challenges using gamification. So she developed it after she had a concussion. That's why her character you see here is Jane the Concussion Slayer. And she created her own little game for motivating her to engage with family and friends and to go through the various kinds of steps that she needed for recovery. And SuperBetter is an attempt to generalize that for all kinds of situations where people have health problems that they are trying to overcome or otherwise trying to improve their situation. And it uses things like quests, where you set missions for yourself, or the game can set them for you. You have your allies, your community, your power-ups that you use to level, and there even are the bad guys, things like here, caffeine and fluorescent lights and running. I guess running in this case is a bad guy if you have a concussion. So as you can see, this is a very game-like kind of approach. As I may have mentioned earlier, Jane McGonigal doesn't like the concept or the term of gamification and wants to focus more on the truly game-like side of the equation. If you recall the chart that I put up, that there's a more behaviorist kind of gamification and a more game-based framework, she's more on the game side, and so this reflects that kind of framing. But it has many of the same kinds of game elements that we've seen in other contexts, just structured in a different way and not using quite the same simplistic kinds of point mechanics and reward mechanics that we see in some of the shallow examples of gamification. But again, an example of trying to help people get better and do better using game elements. Next category is energy and environment. First example here is something called O-Power, and this is a company that gives you reports on how much energy you use in your house and what the patterns are, and you see trends, and so part of it is just a quantification, a feedback mechanism that lets you see how you're doing. And you can see here you're doing good in this case. But it also shows you a bunch of relational data. So this says you used less energy than the average person, but 55% more than your more efficient neighbors. Part of what's interesting about O-Power is it creates a social dynamic, a friendly kind of competition with your friends. So for example, here's a report showing a comparison with your neighbors where you see you, and the bar chart shows what all of your neighbors are doing. So you can see you're worse off than the norm among your neighbors, but really worse off than the category of more efficient neighbors. And what they've been able to show, and researchers have been able to show in other contexts, is that that social dimension, that peer pressure, if you will, is really powerful in getting people to engage in new behaviors like using less electricity. And here we see the goals, which is a similar kind of structure that we've seen in other gamified contexts, and the leaderboard, another way to compare yourself against your friends. O-Power has been able to show roughly a 2 to 4% improvement in the communities where it operates in energy utilization. May not sound like much, but that's enough to drive hundreds of millions of kilowatt hours of energy savings. We're talking about people who use a lot of energy and potentially millions and millions of people in cities that can have this effect. So even a small sustained impact on energy usage is a huge benefit for the energy companies in terms of pollution, in terms of energy sustainability, and so forth. Next example is RecycleBank. RecycleBank has a gamified system of rewards and points and so forth for encouraging people to recycle. So they partner with local communities that have recycling programs and say if you recycle in this program, you earn the points, which you can then redeem for rewards, and they've got a bunch of partnerships with retailers to redeem the rewards. Standard, straightforward kind of gamified system, which they've been able to use in a large number of communities to encourage recycling behavior. Again, this is a perfect example that this basic structure could be about anything, could be about something that's commercial, but it's using those techniques to help improve recycling and create all those sorts of benefits. Education is in many ways ripe for gamification. Student motivation is a huge challenge, and we already have scoring systems and reward systems and credentialing systems and so forth. The challenge is for gamification to make the system better and not worse. Because to the extent that the game elements push students to focus just on those rewards and just on what it takes to optimize on the game, and that's different from the true, authentic, intrinsically motivating learning that they should be engaged in, the gamification system, like a lot of educational reform efforts, might actually harm the educational process rather than help. So that's an important caveat, but there still are ways that gamification, if designed right, can be used in many positive ways in education. And there are a range of different experiments and initiatives going on. One interesting one is something called Quest to Learn, which is an entire school. There's now one in New York and in Chicago built around games and game structures as the entire foundation of the curriculum. It's being led by Katie Salen, who's a noted game designer and game theorist and games educator. So that's one dimension. Two more dimensions to mention quickly, which I've already talked about in the class. One is incorporating game structures into an existing curriculum. Lee Sheldon, I mentioned earlier, he was the one who developed the system in his courses at University of Indiana and Rensselaer Polytechnic that had the insight that normally you start with an A, and then depending on what you do, how you screw up, the mistakes you make, you move down towards an F and you settle wherever you are. Let's say you get a B here. Whereas Sheldon said, well, in a game you start at 0 points as a newbie and you work your way up. And so maybe we should do the system that way and see how far you get and call this an A- or something like that. So that was one of the game structures that he and others have put into their classes. But there's a lot more that can be done, and in fact that people are doing including using quests and challenges and achievement structures and game narratives, all in the service of better pedagogy and better learning. And Lee Sheldon has a whole book out called The Multiplayer Classroom, which I'd commend to you. It talks in great detail about what he has done, but also gives a variety of examples and case studies of both K-12 and higher education teachers that are applying gamification and game structures in really interesting ways. Another dimension of education is the credentialing function, the way that education says, yes, we can confirm you have these skills, which then is useful for an employer or other kinds of organizations that want to know what you've learned. Traditionally, we do this by giving you a diploma or some sort of standardized test, but both of those have limitations, and they're especially limited outside of the traditional formal educational system. So I mentioned earlier the Open Badge framework that the Mozilla Foundation is spearheading. There's also a large contest that some foundations are funding for interesting applications. And again, this is a way to use the game elements of badges as a way of showcasing and confirming certain skills and accomplishments wherever they come from, and allowing students to take those and use them in different places. So two dimensions of education which gamification can potentially offer some solutions. Final category to look at is government. Government? How can government use gamification? Well, several ways. First of all, government can act as an enterprise. A government agency like the U.S. Department of Agriculture has thousands of workers, and so enterprise gamification makes sense for them just like any other enterprise. Secondly, government in many ways interacts with citizens. It provides customer service, anything from voting to getting a driver's license at the DMV to applying for some sort of license or anything else. And there may be activities that government is doing to engage with the public where gamification could have some of the same external benefits that we've seen in other areas. But the third broad area is that government can use gamification and games to promote its policies and to promote benefits for the citizenry of the country or the other domain that the government oversees. And interestingly, in the United States, the White House has brought in a woman named Constance Steinkuhler Squire, who is a very well-known professor focused on games and education at the University of Wisconsin. In 2011, she took an 18-month leave of absence to go work as a policy advisor in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, spearheading a project bringing together work at different government agencies, looking at how games and game elements can promote policy goals of the government. And here's a post that she made on the White House blog talking about some of the things that she's doing and talking about a meeting that was held in late 2011 involving 23 government agencies in the United States, including the Army, the Park Service, the National Endowment for the Arts, NASA, Department of Energy, all of which are doing interesting experiments using games and game elements to promote their agenda. So that's just a taste of some of the ways that gamification can be a tool for social good.